just okay. We're going to get started in just a moment.
Okay.
Dr. Green, do you have a copy of the book with you?
I can get it. You want me to wait? Okay, hold on. Okay, got it.
Okay, great. Good morning, everyone. I'm tremendously honored to welcome you all to another Sunday morning session with one of our special guests. Today, one of my favorite people from the Bayit, and a really interesting someone who is a celebrity of sorts, certainly in academia. Today, we are honored to have Professor Kenneth Green as our special guest. Dr. Green is a professor of religion at the University of Toronto, where he teaches Jewish philosophy. He is author of several books on the thought of Leo Strauss and Maimonides. And his latest book, which is what we're going to be discussing today, is entitled The Philosophy of Emil Fackenheim, From Revelation to the Holocaust. And this is certainly a departure, Dr. Green, from Maimonides, because this is Emil Fackenheim is a modern thinker, philosopher, theologian. And I just wanted, before we get into our discussion, I wanted to show people just the cover of your book. I was going to do it through a PDF, but why don't you just hold up a copy of it?
Sure. There it is.
And it's published by Cambridge University Press.
That's right.
Okay. I've had the opportunity to read the introduction to the book, and I've also had an opportunity to read the majority of the book that you had recommended, which is Fackenheim's first book on the Holocaust, God's Presence in History. And so I have so many questions, more questions than before I started to jump in to dip my toe into the world of Emil Fackenheim. So the first question, first of all, Dr. Green, I know that there's so much and there's a lot of depth in your conversation in your new book. So I'd like to just ask for your indulgence, please, and pretend that your listeners know nothing about Emil Fackenheim so that you start us off from the beginning. If you would, please tell us, who was Emil Fackenheim and why is his thought important to us today?
Well, that's a tall order, but let me try to be as brief as I can and kind of concise to sum up who he was. I mean, there's my personal relationship, which is entirely different, but he was a German Jew who was partly, subject to Nazi control during the 1930s. He was in a concentration camp for almost a year before the war broke out. He was able to, through all kinds of, he was a young man then, he was in his, I guess maybe he was 20 something. He managed to get himself an offer from Aberdeen University for a graduate program, and he escaped from Germany in 1938, a year before the war started. He helped get out his younger brother and his parents as well while he was there. Unfortunately, his older brother refused to leave and was killed in the Holocaust. He was, came to Canada partly through British hands, because they imprisoned a lot of young Jewish men in the UK at that point as possible German origin, as possible spies, and he was then sent to Canada to a kind of prison camp in Sherbrooke. Eventually, they released them. He then went to Hamilton, became a rabbi there, a reform rabbi, and also finished his PhD at Toronto, became a professor at the University of Toronto. Basically later in life, the last sort of significant step in his life was that he moved with his family while he was already in his 60s, in 1983 or 4, he moved to Israel for the rest of his life. So that's basic facts about his life. Why should we be concerned about him? I think my opinion is that of the many thinkers that we have had in the last, 70 years since the end of the war, I think Fackenheim is the most important of them all in terms of Jewish reflection on, the implications of the Shoah for the Jewish people, for Judaism, and for the rest of the world. Now, that's make a big claim because, we have had some impressive thinkers who have said some very powerful things. But I think in the end, and of course, the most famous thing that Fackenheim said, the thing that he always said, the only thing he said that became famous was his 614th commandment, which was that in the wake of the Holocaust, Jews should not grant posthumous victories to Hitler. And that was for him something that was binding on all Jews. He said in one place, it's as if it were given to Moses on Mount Sinai. So he took it very seriously, and it was very controversial, and I guess maybe still is controversial in many people's minds.
What was controversial about it?
Well, I guess really it depends on which angle you view it from. From the point of view of people, well, if I can use this our political language about left and right, from the left's point of view, it made sort of Jewish particularism too central to Jewish life. And from the right's point of view, it somehow implied that the 613 commandments needed a supplement. So, from those were, I'm summing it up very briefly, but those were kind of the essence, and many people said it in many different ways. And other people just said, I guess from a general point of view, that it put the Holocaust too much in the center of Judaism and Jewish life, and that that's not something that we should do. So I guess that's really sums up the controversy that has continued really till the present day. Nevertheless, let me add here before I finish that I think it's one of the most lasting, considering that we're still talking about him 70 years afterwards, the most lasting things that has been said, and one of the things that has made the widest impact. I mean, I'm always amazed at the number of people I hear from all different camps in Judaism and Jewishness quoting that 614th commandment. So it's obviously made an impression on the whole Jewish people and all forms of Jews. So, I mean, that in itself should give us pause to think about Fackenheim and what he meant by this, and why we might still consider him to be a central figure in Jewish thought or Judaism today.
Well, let me pick up on that idea about Fackenheim's emphasis on the Shoah as a central role for every in the 20th and 21st century and beyond. In his writing, and I know that you focus on this as well, Fackenheim calls the Holocaust a severe rupture in Jewish history. It reminded me, in reading his terminology, the essay that Chaim Soloveitchik wrote 25 years ago called Rupture and Reconstruction. But of course, the rupture that Soloveitchik was referring to was a rupture in religious practice.
Yes.
But Fackenheim's discussion of rupture is a rupture in theology and our ability to believe in the same God that we believed before, in light of God's allowance of evil to be perpetrated on such a mass scale. This tremendously evil episode in Jewish history. And what strikes me, and I know that Fackenheim himself discusses this, he seems to point to the Holocaust as a sui generis, as a unique historical experience of persecution and evil for the Jewish people. And what I wanted to ask you is why is it a unique episode in Jewish history? Cannot we point to other cataclysmic events in Jewish history, the two temples destructions, the Crusades, the Spanish Inquisition, the Khmelnytsky massacres, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera? We've been suffering every single generation, it seems, or every other generation. What makes the Shoah different and unique? And finally, what was Fackenheim's solution or resolution to this dilemma of the Shoah acting as a rupture?
Well, you've spoken a mouthful and a lot of different points there that I have to kind of address. I mean, as far as I could hear it, I think there are three different questions in there, and I'll try to address them individually. One of them is, what did he mean by rupture? And the second one is, why is the Holocaust unique? And the third is, what do we do? How do we deal with it? Am I correct? That's kind of
very good. Yeah.
Well, okay, let's start with your first one. Rupture for him signified that something had happened which changed everything, that nothing could be the same again. And his opinion was, and he brought this out, mostly about Jewish things, but in his magnum opus, To Mend the World, he brings it out about three different things which he considers to be the major facets of our world. One is Judaism, the other is Christianity. He thinks it also was ruptured, and philosophy he thinks was ruptured. Now he thinks of philosophy as a kind of catchword for science and the whole rational Western perspective. So all of that, everything, all of them are encompassed. What does he mean by rupture? He means that something happened which really had never happened before. Here we kind of verge off into the second question about uniqueness. Something happened that challenges everything that came before, so that all of those three facets of the Western world, because until To Mend the World, he spoke mostly to the Jews. In The Mend the World, he decided his message was broader than that. He spoke to Jews, Christians, and I guess one could say secular Westerners, and that's what he's kind of including under the rubric of philosophy. And he said that none of these traditions have the wherewithal to answer what he considered to be the radical evil. He used that term, demonic evil, sometimes going beyond that, that was different from anything we had experienced before. He was willing to say that, Judaism had dealt with what he calls epoch-making events, things that happened that changed the course of history. Of course, the most famous one in our history is the destruction of the Second Temple. But there are other events, and everything after that in some way, or maybe not quite everything, but most things changed. But when it comes to the Holocaust, he thought that this went beyond that, and and he was a great student of Midrash. He knew it like the back of his hand. And he had explored the depths of all the texts of Midrash and had not found anything that he found many texts that he found very powerful and used, but none of them had been able to sort of explain in some theological sense, and he came to a view that there could not be an explanation. The Holocaust was so radical, the evil was so radical, that the question of explanation, even theological, kind of reconciliation with past tradition, was not something we could do. He said that only thing we can do, maybe someday, but the only thing we can do is respond. He spoke about response rather than explanation. Now that evil, when you say why was it unique? Well, he developed, he was careful about these things to take the historians seriously. So he looked at the history, he knew the history, knew all the works that had been important out there. He was very close friends with some of the great historians, Yehuda Bauer and Raoul Hilberg, and he'd read their works and many other works. And he came to the conclusion that there were some features of the Holocaust that were unlike any persecution of the Jews before, and unlike any persecution of any people. I mean, whether when he compared, on the one hand, the genocide of the Armenians in the First World War, and he showed why it wasn't quite like that. He talked about, slaughters of Native Americans or Indians in North America and why it wasn't like that. Like he said things like a reservation for Jews in Nazi Europe was inconceivable. There would never be whatever bad things were done, the Indians were still allowed to survive. The Armenians, he said that the Turks were very uneven. Sometimes they went after them, and when it came to Istanbul and other places, they decided to forget about those Armenians. But whereas the Nazis were determined to kill every single Jew, not just men, not just women, but children. The fact that 1 million children were killed in the Holocaust. For what? For the crime of being Jewish. This is something that had never happened before. And as he goes so far as to say things like martyrdom, which had been essential parts of the Jewish religious experience for generations, unfortunately, were not even things that made sense anymore, because then we had a choice. When you talk about martyrdom, usually it involved, Christians or Muslims saying, either convert to our religion or we'll kill you. So you could convert if you wanted. And many texts, Maimonides and others, deal with what you do if you had to pass for a while. But he said this was also inconceivable. The Nazis didn't care what you believed. They didn't care whether you were religious or secular. They just wanted to kill Jews. And they were systematic about it, unlike any effort that had been made of persecution in the past. They hunted down obscure Jews in mountain villages and other things, because killing Jews was a virtue for them. And there are other facts that he brought to bear, and he made a kind of case that he actually, because he was aware of what historians think, he preferred the word unprecedented to unique, because unique involves all kinds of strange philosophical debates. But he said it was unprecedented. And that, of course, has an unfortunate side to it, because unprecedented means that it could be setting a precedent. And he believed that, that's part of the reason we have to think about it and be aware of it, because this is a great danger, not just to the Jews, although very much for them, of course, but for us as a people, but for everyone, for the whole world. So that's, those are the kind of rudimentary aspects of rupture and uniqueness. And the question of what we should do in response to all of that. Well, of course, response is the key word here. He thought that the response comes out in the 614th commandment. The 614th commandment has four aspects about it, which one has to be aware of if we're going to see that it wasn't just sort of a rhetorical statement, but had about it, real heft. He thought that, first of all, Jews must remain Jews. That's, of course, the most obvious implication, not giving Hitler posthumous victories. Number two, they must remember the victims of the Holocaust. They must not forget them. Number three, they mustn't despair of man, even though it's tempting in the sense of the depravity that was shown. And fourth, they mustn't despair of God, which of course some survivors have done. So in all those areas, those are the beginnings of response, the proper response. Of course, for him, and that's just kind of in abstract terms. Let me just finish on this note. The most important response that the Jewish people have done is to establish the state of Israel. And, he was, after the 1967 war, a passionate Zionist. I'd say that before that, he wasn't particularly oriented toward Israel or Zionism. But when he started to think about the Holocaust, he realized how important it was. And by the way, that's not unique to him. Some rabbis from the Holocaust itself, Rabbi Shapira and Rabbi Teichtal, they were all turned around toward Zionism, even from a Haredi position, toward affirmation, because Fackenheim felt, let me just leave it at this, that this establishment of the state of Israel was the affirmation that the Jews were going to live and not die. And he said, to add a little one last note, that was not so obvious. It may seem obvious to us now, but he said the natural reaction of most people, in most circumstances, to something that like the Holocaust would be either fatal despair or running as far away from the kind of cause or whatever it was that brought this about. And he's the fact that the Jews established a state and that they decided that they were going to live. That was the sign that they had heard the 614th commandment. And even if they didn't know about it, they were obeying it sort of unconsciously.
All right. Well, thank you for that. I want to get a little bit more involved. Just to dip our big toe into the water, because there's a lot here. If you could sort of shed some light on Fackenheim's view of history in general. I mean, he was a self-described Hegelian. So if you could just give us a little bit of background. I mean, all of us are armchair philosophers. Who was Friedrich Hagel of the 18th century? Why was his philosophy of history so important to Fackenheim? And just as a follow-up to that question, Hegel is not really associated so much with the world of religion in a positive light. I mean, he had this pantheistic assertion that man is God and God is man, and history is man's way of being divine in some way. Doesn't that present a danger to traditional Jewish theology? And doesn't Hegel lay the groundwork for Marxism and communism? And how does Fackenheim use Hegel to develop a theology of the Holocaust? So it's a lot there. I'm sorry.
Yeah, you like to ask the tough ones, Rabbi. You're not letting me off easy on this one. Okay, I'll try my best to answer a lot of that in as simple a way as I can. Where do I start? Fackenheim was let's look at his life, because that's where all this becomes into play. He was, from the time he came to Canada when he finished his PhD and got a job at the University of Toronto until 1967, he was a theologian and a philosopher, I guess one would say. And his theology was, he wrote fascinating essays on Jewish theology that were collected in a book of his called Quest for Past and Future. These were all the pre-1967 essays. And in that, he accepted a position which was that, nothing, he quoted Franz Rosenzweig, the Jewish thinker, nothing new could happen between Sinai and the Mashiach. Nothing new could happen, that the essential core of Judaism had been laid down and it would remain the same until the final redemption. And he started to doubt that. Of course, he started to become aware, not just, this was already before his Holocaust consciousness grew so large, but even in the sense that was possible for Judaism. He realized that at various points, Jews had to take history seriously. They had to be aware of the fact that their history had taken strange twists and turns, and they had to understand that in terms of their faith. So that his original non-historical Judaism gave way to a historical Judaism. Then, of course, he came to terms with the Holocaust. And he also, of course, for him, the turning point was the Six-Day War, when he thought that a second Holocaust could happen because the Arabs had threatened that they were going to continue doing what the Germans had done. So he became aware that, and he started to research it. And that book that you showed to people was his first effort in that, called God's Presence in History. And he called Jewish Affirmations and Philosophical Reflections. Thank you. That's the subtitle. So he felt that you could not make sense of Judaism without thinking about history. Now, in order to think about history, he looked at midrashic sources, biblical sources, all kinds of things, mystics. But he also found that secular philosophers had reflected on this, and he saw a connection that Hegel's philosophy was useful for Jews in thinking about their history. And he also found out that there were Jewish thinkers, maybe not so well known, in the 19th century who had taken Hegel seriously. People like Nachman Krochmal, who wrote a book called Moreh Nevuchei Hazman, the Guide of the Perplexed of Our Time. So this was not unique to him, to Fackenheim, but he came to the conclusion, well, okay, then there's another side of it, which I don't know if we need to go into so much. But he also felt that modern philosophy, he was also professor of philosophy and a philosophic thinker. Modern philosophy had come to rely a great deal on history. Many things have to be validated now by showing their historical authenticity or the history of them, how they came to be what they are, and all that kind of thing. So that too required him to look at Hegel. Now, the point you made about Hegel and Marx is
Well, first, if you could back up, just tell us what is Hegel's philosophy of history?
sorry, yes, of course. Well, Hegel believed that there was it's almost a kind of messianic history, except of course it culminates in modern times. History was a kind of back and forth motion. He has a word for this. He calls it a dialectic. It's a fancy word, but it means that things sort of are in tension with one another at two extremes. And out of those extremes comes a middle position, which he called the synthesis. And that is a movement forward. So history moves toward a goal. That goal is ultimately, he thought, modern times. And there's a progressive movement. History is not a backward movement or a one step forward, two steps back. It was a progressive thing. Now, all of that, of course, Fackenheim became skeptical about. He called himself, which is a perplexing title, a post-Hegelian Hegelian. In other words, he liked Hegel, but he didn't really believe in Hegel. He didn't think it would work, that whole system that Hegel worked out. But he did think that Hegel had taught us certain things about thinking about history. And that would, of course, differentiate him and his kind of understanding of Hegel from somebody like Marx, who thought that Hegel had given us the key to history and knew exactly where everything was going. So Fackenheim wasn't convinced that we could read the tea leaves of history the way that true Hegelians thought that we could, but he did think that we could understand a lot more about the way it happened. Things happened. There was a logic to what happened that isn't just a chance or a series of accidental events, or on the other hand, simple divine providence. And there was a human hand in participating in this, and that plays a great role. So that is his use of Hegel without being, I guess to put it more simply, he used Hegel without being really a Hegelian. He didn't really.
And how does that Hegelian philosophy inform his understanding of the Shoah, of the Holocaust?
Well, because he starts to understand these decisive moments in the history of Judaism and the Jews where their history changed forever. We could look at it from the time of the slavery in Egypt to the first temple being destroyed and the return from that Babylonian exile, the second temple being destroyed and the long exile which followed, things that you mentioned like the expulsion of the Jews from Spain or the Chmielnicki massacres. They changed the course of history. And Fackenheim thinks that that's a kind of helpful, illumination from history, but it isn't enough to understand what happened in the middle of the 20th century. So yes, history from now on cannot, and anyone who denies history, he thought that there were sort of people on the left and people on the right who don't want to look at history, and that to him was a kind of a willful delusion, a wish not to face facts, not to deal with reality. And of course, he thought that the two most important events to happen to the Jews in the last 2,000 years were the Holocaust and the establishment of the State of Israel. And both of them have changed what we think about ourselves, how our lives are lived, our religious life, everything. There's nothing that's quite the same anymore. And he used Hegel to sort of help him understand those events. Not to say that he kind of figured everything out. He wasn't saying he knew all the answers. He was simply saying we have to deal with these things. I think that would be a better way of describing his position.
Was Fackenheim in any way messianic? Did he believe that we are on a progression, on a continuum, and we are getting closer and closer to ultimate redemption?
Well, he certainly retained the messianic faith. He thought that was one of the consequences, the fourth element of the 614th commandment. In other words, we should not despair of God, that redemption will happen. But he did not think that anything that was happening in our time, maybe I should qualify that a little. At first, when he discovered Israel, so to speak, and when the 6 Day War happened, he felt a bit of that messianic enthusiasm that many people felt. But as he kind of, sobered up from to the realities, he realized that none of that overshadowed the Holocaust, the Shoah. Nothing made it sort of better or resolved any questions from that. It did leave us, though, with he preferred, in a way, in his later thought, not to talk about messianism or redemption, which he thought was something we could hope for, but which is a long way from reality based on what we have, at least in terms of what we see in the world. But he did think that there were things that kind of smacked of it, kind of hinted at it. And he starts to speak about what he calls a tikkun or tikkunim. There were things that gave us some hope, that the future was not bleak, that there was hope for, but it wasn't a simple messianism. I would say no, that if he had it for a very brief time, he kind of gave it up. He realized that would not sustain him. Partly, by the way, influenced by Elie Wiesel, who made the famous statement that a Messiah who didn't come during the Holocaust is not worth waiting for. That kind of attitude, I guess one could say, which is a little bit dark, but that influenced Fackenheim to tone down any messianism that he might have associated with the Six-Day War or with other events in Jewish history since then.
But I don't detect that kind of cynicism from Fackenheim's writing.
No, you're quite right.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't think Fackenheim would ever have said something like that, but it did kind of make him realize one should be more careful in what one says, that we can't sort of engage in enthusiastic messianism when we're still dealing with, and he thought that we would be dealing with for many generations still to come, the trauma of the Holocaust. The whole Jewish people, one could say in that sense, is a traumatized people. As we talk now, are aware of trauma in human behavior and individual life. He thought it also applied to national life, and as a people, we are living out that trauma. And that means that as with traumatized individuals, you must be careful in proceeding into the future. You must try to sort of deal with that. And it's not going to just sort of lift and disappear. It's a long-term dealing, situation we must deal with.
And I noticed he dedicated his first book to Elie Wiesel.
That's correct. They were
yeah.
good friends. They were good friends.
Good thing. All right, so we come now to 2020,
Okay.
and Dr. Kenneth Green, who's one of the disciples of Emil Fackenheim, writes a book about the philosophy of Fackenheim, his teacher. Why was it important for you to write this book? What needed to be clarified that wasn't already stated by Emil Fackenheim himself?
Well, that's an interesting question. I mean, I was his student, and I owe him a lot, and I feel attached, to his memory but, for many years, I have to say, I didn't really think about, I shouldn't say I did think about it, but I didn't write about Fackenheim. I, worked on other things, as you mentioned, Maimonides, Leo Strauss, other Jewish thinkers. And in some ways, I was a bit hesitant. I didn't think that, Fackenheim had said what needed to be said. I didn't know what I could add to it, and other than just repeating what he had said. And I didn't even know that I wanted to be the one to repeat what he said. There were other people doing that, and that was perfectly legitimate for them to do. But I think at a certain point, and I can probably date the turning point. I mean, it was around the year 2000, the Durban conference, and then of course 9/11, and all of that whole year of changes in the world. I realized that what Fackenheim said was not just a phase in history, a post-war, post-Holocaust phase, but was something true. At least that's what it seemed to me. And from then on, I started rethinking, and at a certain point, I decided, there's more here than has been said. And I decided I needed to say it. Now, what I think, what I say in the book that is different from what other people have said, I deal with the question of Fackenheim on Revelation in the book, was that something, and some people have accused him of sort of a kind of an inappropriate notion of Revelation, of the 614th commandment. And I realized that he was quite aware of that problem of speaking that way, but he came up with something quite different. And if you read his works, I think what you find, and certainly what I found, is he had a kind of a bizarre world of revelation that did happen, but it wasn't the one that most people accused him of, or that it seemed of. He came up with a concept of what I call diabolical revelation. This was the first time in history, you might say, that we have seen the full, to use traditional language, the full power of Satan played out on the stage of history. And that's not something that just happens and then disappears. It's something we must think about. We must take account of. We must plan for the future in responding to, because human situation, according to Fackenheim, has changed. We are now faced with a possibility of something we never thought possible before. And that means that both as Jews and in the non-Jewish world as well, must think about this terrible human possibility that is now part of the story of the human race. And that's not something that we can just bury in the past and say, oh, well, that's the, gone and now we can forget about it. It's a reality that we must think about religiously, secularly, all of that. So I think, that's the theme that I think in a unique way in this book, other than some other lesser thoughts, but that's the big thought I think I have. And that's a very problematic concept. I know that. Sorry, yeah, go on.
Yeah, no. So Dr. Green, when you talk about revelation,
yeah,
you're not talking about divine revelation. You're talking about satanic revelation. Can you just expand a little bit on that and talk to us a little bit about Fackenheim's relationship with divine revelation? How did he understand where God was during the Holocaust, and how did he make peace with that?
Well, that's a very difficult question, and to a couple of questions, really. He relied on people like Rav Shapira and others who wrote from within. He said, or secular Jews like Primo Levi. He felt that the only way we can really understand what happened is to listen to the survivors, or the people who didn't survive, who left us testimony in writing. And their testimony is what we should base ourselves on. And basically all the people who were there, whether of a religious bent or of a secular bent, had the sense that this was like nothing that had ever happened to humanity before. Certainly nothing that ever happened in a religious context before. And the question.
And when you talk about Rav Shapira, I should just clarify, you're talking about Rav Plotimus Kalman Shapira, the Rav of Piazetzna. Yeah, I know your son Daniel is enamored by him. So
yes, Aish Kodesh is the work he wrote, and there's a shul in New York named for that, and he's kind of known as the Aish Kodesh. But he died he was killed in the Holocaust, and he luckily left behind sermons of his which have been preserved, and people have studied them with great care, preserved them. And he went from a position that, perhaps we would call Haredi, to a position that we would call Zionist. And that was because he recognized something had happened here that was not part of the Jewish script, something that we were familiar with. We dealt with persecutions over the ages. We dealt with oppression. We had our ways of dealing with them. But this was not like any of those. So the question then becomes, well, what was it? I mean, where was God, as you say? And many of the survivors have asked, most of them, I guess, have asked the same question. And I don't think Fackenheim, basically his answer to that was, we can't answer that question. It's something that we will have to figure out over time. We know that God was present to individuals. We know there were religious individuals who did wonderful things, and he respects and preserves the memory of those things. But they don't answer the larger question, those individuals. The event that happened requires this is why he talks about history and not just, the life of religious individuals. And the question then becomes, if we don't understand a divine presence, I mean, there are religious thinkers who do believe there was a divine presence there, but Fackenheim believes there was a slight moment, there were moments of divine presence, you could say, when Jews decided to resist. When they resisted, whether spiritually or physically, militarily, that was when a spark of the divine appeared. These are only tikkunim, as he calls them, only sort of small moments of repair of the world. But the world was, in that sense, and he's kind of I won't say he's following the RE. He's the Rabbi Isaac Luria, but he is sort of trying to take that concept and develop it in a new direction. The idea that something was, of a shattering nature that happened, and that is, as we believe that the Shekhinah went into exile with us, here he has to believe that God suffered, but it's not the kind of suffering that we would think of as human suffering. He quotes a statement of Rav Shapiro that he then builds on, saying that God was so loved the world that he didn't allow his anger and sorrow to destroy the world when he witnessed what was happening. I mean, here I would, have to say that there's an implication of Fackenheim's thought, which I haven't really written about in the book, and it's more in a sense what I'm thinking of, and that is, but I maybe I shouldn't go into that. That's not going to lead us into Fackenheim's thought, but maybe for another occasion. But the fact of God's presence is, of course, the great question. Now, he thinks that those moments of repair, of mending, of tikkun were the only hope that we can derive. And there were many of them on an individual level. They don't change the character of what happened. We know something terrible happened that can't be, just ignored because of these good moments. But we have to keep those moments in mind and in heart so that we do not despair, again, obeying the 614th commandment. And we hope that things will become clearer to us. But the nature of it cannot be a divine revelation. It cannot be God's presence that we feel, not when the world was, as he calls it, kind of a kingdom unto its own, the Holocaust kingdom, and sometimes kind of a demonic world where everything was calculated to make the Jews suffer and to kill them. That is a world that we haven't known before. So what kind of world is that? And he keeps speaking about things demonic, diabolical, and he realized that this was, usually we think about evil, and if you look at the Rambam, as kind of what he calls a privation. In other words, it's an absence of good. That works on a certain level, but he thought it wasn't sufficient, or at least he came around to the view that it wasn't sufficient, that there had to be an admission that something of an evil nature had occurred, which was more powerful than anything we had thought the power of evil had. One of the points he makes, it's kind of a small point, was, in the concept of hell, Gehinnom, we had the notion that the guilty are punished, but as he said, the innocent, Satan cannot touch the innocent. He can tempt them, but he can't force them to do anything. He said during the Holocaust, the innocent were targeted, the innocent were killed, the million children. So he said, this is something, these are terrible facts that we almost don't want to see. We'd rather not see. But if we can't avoid them, they come back to haunt us. Even if we don't, we try to pretend they aren't there. And that gives us the sense that something of a malevolent, evil nature reached a power in the world that was like anything that we thought. He used a kind of a bizarre phrase that is hard to understand, but I'll say it anyways. He said, more was real than was possible. In other words, we didn't think, to put it simpler, he didn't think no one thought that such a thing as the Holocaust was even humanly possible. So we have to understand that as a new reality. And that new reality involves a presence of Satan, at least potentially, that can go beyond anything we imagined before, and certainly is not sufficiently answered by saying an absence of good.
All right. The way that you're describing his philosophy, his theology of God, he's speaking as a man who was traumatized by the Holocaust person. Yeah. He's speaking for an entire generation of people who have been traumatized by the Holocaust. Yes. We're now many decades beyond where Fackenheim was. Our children do not have the imprint of the Holocaust as strongly as our parents or as our generation has had it. The world, certainly, based on polls that are being taken, the majority of the world hasn't even heard of the Holocaust. Right. How does Fackenheim's work, first of all, has it aged well in a less traumatized world? Mm-hmm. And second of all, how is it as relevant to us, both as Jews or to the world in general, as it was in the past? And how do we make it more relevant? If indeed it is important to preserve that message, how do we go about making that message more relevant today?
Well, that's a challenge. That's a real challenge. And I don't know the answer in any simple way. I mean, you ask whether, we're in the same situation. And that's a good question. Was Fackenheim's thought, what some people say, just an effect of the immediate, post-Holocaust era, the generation that was, directly influenced by it, affected by it? Part of me thought that too. I mean, I have to say that until I came around to that change around the year 2000, I thought that, well, that's kind of a good message for the 40s and 50s and 60s and maybe into the 70s. But, times have changed. We're all in a new world. We don't have to look at it. But I realize that's not true. And I don't know. I mean, that's obviously my personal view. But I do think that while, people might not want to face what Fackenheim's saying, I think that they are forced to. And I do think that the Jewish world, and I think of this of young people too, because I'm a professor, I meet young people in my daily occupations. And I do feel that while they may not feel it in the same way, it's there in their minds. I had to give a lecture on this in England, actually in Scotland a few years ago. And one of the most interesting things they asked me was, how can you justify, continuing along these lines? And I said, well, like talking about Fackenheim's message. And I said, well, I think the world shows that it hasn't, there's so many books and movies and, discussions that still talk about the Holocaust, means that people cannot get it out of their system. It's there even when they don't want it to. And I think the reason it's there is because we don't understand it. We can't make sense of it. It isn't something we can sort of file away as, oh yes, now I understand that. I understand what happened. And I think that lack of understanding is what becomes an impetus for us to at least look at people like Fackenheim. I mean, there are others too. I'm not saying only Fackenheim, but I do believe that he is the most central, and obviously my opinion that, and I do believe that, he addresses the major issues in ways that are more balanced than anybody else. Now, is there a kind of rhetorical style that Fackenheim had that might not be as appealing to people today? Perhaps, he was kind of like a prophet crying in the wilderness, and sometimes, people thought he was, kind of extreme. He was, obsessed with the Holocaust. I heard that, whenever I said I was a student of Fackenheim, I almost inevitably got people telling me this kind of stuff, and it driven him nuts or whatever. He was a good philosopher before, and then once he got involved in this, he lost his mind. All kinds of things are said, and I don't think any of that obviously is true, but I do understand why people feel it. At the time, it seemed as we got further away. But Fackenheim's view is that we're trying to just, like any trauma that we've been through. I mean, it's not even a proper analogy in some ways, but for a human being, it's something you want to bury. You don't want to know. You want to get rid of it. That's the way we usually deal with these things. And that doesn't, if it would be nice if that worked, but it doesn't work. We now know enough about human psychology to know that's a fake way of dealing with our problems. I mean, it's understandable. It's too painful to face. It's not like there's no bad motive in it, but it doesn't work.
All right, Professor Green, I want to move a little bit towards you, if I may.
Yeah.
You are a member of an Orthodox shul. You have raised a family together with your amazing wife, Professor Sharon Green, raised a Shomer Shabbos home of all three of your sons are amazing talents and great contributors to the world of Orthodox Judaism. You are a disciple of Emil Fackenheim, a Reform rabbi, self-described liberal Jew. How does that happen? In other words, and as we were talking in advance of our discussion this morning, you said that what you are today is a product of Emil Fackenheim, and how does that happen?
Well, first of all, my story, but I don't want to talk about my story first. Let me just tell you about Fackenheim, which isn't really a correct, I mean, the impression many people have of Fackenheim is not correct. Yes, he was a Reform rabbi. Yes, he retained his affiliation with Reform Judaism in some sense, but he lived a life of, more or less of an Orthodox Jew. He went to an Orthodox synagogue. He raised his own children Orthodox, and he didn't necessarily believe in all the dogmas or the beliefs of Orthodoxy, but he did believe in something good. So for me, it was an example of something important that he had taken from this experience. I mean, his main point, which was that, by living an Orthodox life as he did, and yet not cutting off his connection with Reform Judaism, was an important value for him, because he believed one of the lessons of the Holocaust is the unity of the Jewish people. We might not agree with each other on all points, and we should maintain our differences insofar as they're important, but we should also have an overriding sense of the unity of the Jews. Our people are the first order of business before anything else. We're one people. And that sounds like a rhetorical statement, but he meant it and lived by it. Me, it's a different story, I guess. I don't even know how to explain my own story. I don't have that distance from myself. But, for me, it was many different things happened in life that led me in this direction and made me conclude. But I don't believe that by living within the Orthodox world, living an Orthodox life, contradicts learning from Fackenheim, because the Fackenheimian message is, wisdom comes from all sorts of sources, and we must take wisdom where it comes. And Fackenheim was right about this, I think, even if he, his connection with Reform Judaism was when he told himself a liberal Jew. Most of that was actually pre-1967 Fackenheim. I think he changed a lot after that. But he didn't want to make a big issue of that, because he didn't think that the differences between Jews were the most important thing about our world. In fact, one of his major points of the post-Holocaust world is that we must, that Israel is an experiment for the whole world on how religious and secular people have to learn to live together, even when they maintain their differences. They shouldn't give them up for light causes. They should stick to their guns, but they must also find a way of living together. So, I don't find that learning from Fackenheim is a problem because of who he was as a faithful Jew, and as a Jew who lived he respected and kept as well as he could the 613th commandments as well as the 614th. And I think that message is there. And of course, he did other things which put us all to shame. I mean, he picked up in his relative old age and went off and lived in Israel, thinking that was also an important message. Well, Fackenheim was a man who forced us to see beyond our narrow self-dividers, which aren't irrelevant and aren't minor and things we shouldn't necessarily give up, but we must be able to see beyond them at the same time that we see within them. That's how I learned that from him.
If I could just comment on that if that's the only message that we get from Emil Fackenheim, Dayenu, that message of unity, that message of who is a wise man, he who learns from all people, and not to have that kind of tunnel vision that prevents us from expanding our vistas and realizing that there's a way of looking at the world that can actually, that may be outside the Beit Midrash, but that may actually inform everything that we study inside the Beit Midrash.
Yes, I think that's a very Fackenheimian message. We can learn from the outside for what we bring to our Judaism. It enriches us as well as enabling us to contribute to the world, which Fackenheim thought we urgently need to do. It's not just about us learning from the world outside. The world outside must learn from us, and we can't afford to let them kind of live in our own world and just leave our message for ourselves. Fackenheim thought we have an urgent message for the world right now. Never mind, the basic, God, Torah, and Israel message, but the message of what's happened in recent times, that it's essential that we bring that message. I mean, that book that you showed is kind of his way of spreading his message as best he could to as many people as he could. And I think he continued to do that.
Let me ask you one last question, and then if anyone has questions on the Zoom call, you're welcome to post them on the chat. Right now in the University of Toronto, you're teaching a course on the Moreh Nevuchim, on Maimonides' Guide for the Perplexed. You're teaching a course on an Introduction to Jewish Mysticism. So your work on Fackenheim is certainly a departure from the major body of your work. Do you find that there's any intersection between the two, or that they're not connected in any way?
No, I think that's an interesting question. I think they are connected, actually. I mean, one of the things which, the Rambam, and I guess if I look in modern times, the Leo Strauss teaches us, is the importance of religion in human life and the things we have to learn from it, and that it's not something that we can afford to do without. And I think that helps appreciate Fackenheim, where he sees that there's this which we can't leave behind, we can't abandon it, we must cling, as it were, to our tradition. At the same time, for both Rambam and Fackenheim, the world outside counts for something too. So we have these two sources that from which we are obligated to learn. We live by our Judaism, but we learn from everyone that there is to learn from. And I think that Fackenheim was very much on that wavelength. He wasn't, he was interested in mysticism and Kabbalah, and he used it in his book To Mend the World. But I think his commitments ultimately were more to that, Maimonidean worldview, even though in some ways, as I've kind of alluded, he broke with it on the question of evil. But listen, these are internal debates between people of very great minds who are thinking about very profound problems. And, but I first learned, let me say biographically, I first learned about the Rambam and his thought from Fackenheim. He's the man who got me to go on to study Jewish philosophy. He wasn't only teaching his own thought, but he was concerned to teach the whole legacy of Jewish thought. Sure. And so, he didn't think that his thought excluded all of that.
Sure, of course. Well, is there anything that you'd like to add that I haven't brought up yet about Fackenheim, about your work?
Well, the only thing I hope that will come of this is that people will talk about him again. He deserves to be more in the center of discussion, and he should not be restricted to certain circles. I think his 614th commandment will continue as something that impresses itself on Jews, even in younger generations. And when I talk about it with younger people, I find that they are struck by it. It doesn't strike them perhaps with the immediacy that people of our generation or our parents' generation might have felt, but it still is an important message for our time, and I think for the future as well.
Well, on that, Professor Kenneth Hart-Green, I just want to thank you so much for being so generous with your time and your knowledge today, and really tremendous success with the book. It's published by Cambridge University Press, and I hope that your hope comes true, that people do continue speaking about Emil Fackenheim, his emphasis on the Holocaust, because that is the credo. We must never forget. Yes. If we do forget, we are doomed to repeat history, and that's what we cannot afford to do, not only for the Jewish people, but for all of mankind. And so thank you so much, and continued success in all that you're doing. Chazak ve'ematz. Thank you so much. Have a great day, everybody. Thank you.
Well, thank you for discussing it here. I appreciate your interest in it. So thank you, Rabbi.
All right. Have a good day, everyone. Take care.